Good morning, everyone. I'm Carl Villakova from Monmouth University's Urban Coast Institute. Thanks for joining us on what's becoming pretty much a more timely discussion by the hour. Although the hurricane season officially began June 1st, we're now entering what's considered the peak hurricane season. And it's beginning to show as we watch Hurricane Gert track north on the Weather Channel. Mid-August through October usually sees about 3/4 of the tropical storm days and 9 out of 10 hurricane days each year. We can also expect to start hearing a lot more about the 5th anniversary of Superstorm Sandy as the weeks progress. If you live in the Jersey Shore area like I do, you probably know of someone who ignored the evacuation orders and decided to stay in place. My aunt and uncle, who live in Manasquan, actually did that, and they had to take refuge upstairs when the first floor flooded and loose boats from a nearby yard started bumping into the houses in their neighborhood. And, when I heard that story, I just wondered, what would make my aunt and uncle, make a decision like that? What messages could have changed their minds? And how can we better communicate storm risk to people who live in coastal areas that are vulnerable? Today we have 3 speakers who have a lot of great insight to share on this subject. And they are Sarah Watson, who led the development of NOAA's Risk Communication Basics Guidebook. If you haven't seen it, it's a super resource, and I'm going to post a link to it online along with a recording of this webinar a little later this week. Next will be Rachel Hogan Carr, who is the Executive Director of the Nurture and Nature Center in Easton, PA. Rachel's worked on a lot of flood-related research and education projects, including one titled, "They Had the Facts, Why Didn't They Act?", which looked at Jersey Shore residents' responses to warnings issued by the National Weather Service during Sandy. And finally, Mike Oppegaard is the Emergency Management Coordinator here in Monmouth County, which was one of the real ground zeros during Sandy. Mike is going to talk about some of the innovative disaster planning and response work the county's been up to since Sandy. And after the presentations, we're going to open it up for an audience Q&A. But if you do have any pressing questions for one of the speakers before then, you can type it into the chat window, and I'll relay it to them. On a final note, a few thank yous. First, obviously, to our presenters for taking the time this morning, but also to the UCI's partner on this webinar, the Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean, and to NOAA for providing grant support that made this session possible, and to Lisa R. Muller at JC Nears, who was just a huge help as I got this discussion organized. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah to get us started. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Carl. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to speak to all of you about risk communication. I don't know that Carl did not necessarily mention this, but 5 years ago, I was the reporter at the Press of Atlantic City covering Hurricane Sandy and ultimately transitioned into covering that full-time and the recovery full-time. And without question, every single time I asked somebody when I was interviewing them if they evacuated and they said no, I would ask why, and the number one response, and probably it's almost unanimous in saying they didn't think it would be that bad, or they didn't think anything bad would happen to them, that they didn't think something that really triggered me into trying to figure out a little bit more about why people behave the way they do and why people respond to risks the way they do. And ultimately, I ended up going back to graduate school and leaving journalism and focusing on not just climate adaptation and coastal resilience policy and planning, but also the social science behind why people respond to risks the way they do and how could we improve communication to work with that better. But I first want to note a little bit of nuance in this, in that risk communication has, I think of it as having 2 key areas. And that first one is the short-term or the crisis communication, and that's when you have the storm bearing down or about the storm is imminent or the hazard is imminent. And so what works for that type of communication is slightly different than if you're planning for the long-term and future risks, because the long-term and the future risks may not be necessarily as urgent for somebody to plan to think about. I expect that both Rachel and Mike will talk about the short-term and the crisis communication, so I really wanted to focus on first beginning with the long-term and the future risks, because that's often the focus of the Risk Communication Basics guidebook. And as Carl mentioned, this is on digital post. It discusses a lot of the social science principles behind risk perception, and it also provides a lot of tips for how to improve risk communication, and also some sample conversations to see how some of these work with real conversations and people. Also, I will discuss a few little resources at the end that are also on the page with that guidebook. And usually when I'm talking about any kind of learning activity, I usually like to let people fall into figuring out the takeaways, but in this case, I'm actually going to break that and start with the first things that I want folks to remember, because these are the two things that we do the most when it comes to communicating about risks. We like to give everybody a lot of information, but the problem is that more information without steps to take action is not going to help. But more importantly, the more you give people facts about something, the more it confirms what they already believe. And the belief is really important, because that has a very deep implication for how we perceive risks. So what I want folks to recognize is that what gradually helps people change their minds and their behavior is presenting information and offering realistic and appropriate solutions in a way that is already consistent with how they view the world and what they already believe. And I'm sure you're going, wow, that sounds really difficult. And it's challenging, but there are ways that you can gradually learn to be able to do that effectively. The second communication takeaway is that fear is not necessarily the best motivator, especially when we're talking about the long-term risks. Fear and scaring people or causing them to feel anxiety about the long-term or the future flood may cause them to walk away from the conversation, and I will explain why that does that in a minute. The first thing I want to talk about is a little bit about how we think and how we process our thoughts, because that has a direct impact on how we also perceive risk. And the first way that we think is through our emotions and what we've already experienced, and that can be referred to as thinking fast. And an example of that is if you see a really big scary dog coming at you, you're not going to stop to calculate whether or not that dog is coming for you, whether that dog is actually a risk to you personally. You're going to see that and get out of there. But we also think about things in terms of analytical thinking, and that's where we're actually calculating or trying to think about things in a deeper context, and that can be often referred to as thinking slow. And if you're solving a math problem, for example, it's going to take you a little bit more time than it is going to figure out than it is for, saying you're seeing the dog coming at you. But what also plays into this is our emotions, and emotions have a very deep impact for how we are ultimately going to perceive a risk, and how we feel about a risk ultimately determines whether or not we think it's a risk to us personally. And I like to use clowns, for example, for this one. If all you ever knew about a clown was what you're seeing on the screen, chances are you're probably not going to be too worried about it. And you all know what's coming right now, I imagine. If you saw that as a clown, and that's the only thing you ever knew about a clown, you're probably going to have a very different feeling and a very different reaction. The problem is that we can only handle so many fears and so many anxiety-inducing things at once. And so we all have this thing called the finite pool of worry. And I like to use this example of this giant swimming pool where you imagine that pool is your brain, and all of those people and all of those things in the water are all of your thoughts and all of the things that you're concerned about. And you can see that there's really not much room left for everything else. And so when we invoke fear and we invoke anxiety for long-term risk, we don't really have much space for it, because we need to focus on what's immediate and what's personal and what's going to happen soon. The second thing that I want to talk about is one of those little mental models that we have, and that's our confirmation bias. And I like to use this example just to illustrate what we mean by confirmation bias. And that's where we're cherry-picking information to confirm what we already believe. And this is one of those famous ones where some folks may think that if they see a weather forecast that doesn't necessarily work out so well, they think that that's proof that, say, climate change is not real, and that they're using that information to confirm what they already believe. Another mental model that I like to talk about is single action bias, and that's where if we do one thing, that's all we need to, that's enough for us to we figured out that we've solved it. And I use the example of the light bulb, for example, because a lot of times we think that the solution for climate change is that we just need to change our light bulbs, and that's all we need to do. The next thing I want to talk about is what I mentioned at the very beginning, which was when we talked about how people didn't think anything bad would happen to them during Sandy, and that's the optimism bias, and that we're hardwired in a way to actually think that nothing bad is going to happen to us, that bad things happen to other people. What also affects how we view risks and how we perceive risks is our worldview, and that comes down to how we think society should function and how we think people should interact with each other. And it can be also referred to as our personal values. And so we can actually sit there and look at, if you have one set of personal values, you may perceive a risk completely differently than somebody else. And some of that is formed by what the social environment was like when you grew up and also what your friends and your family think. The challenge is that putting on somebody else's worldview shoes is really hard, and it does not come easily or naturally, and so it takes us some time to kind of figure out how to actually start thinking about what other people are, how people are perceiving things differently. And there's a lot more about this in the guidebook, so please go back and read that and see if it resonates and makes sense to you. And overall, just what shapes our risk perception is our personal values, our emotions, what our friends and family think. And then also, I had mentioned earlier about the solutions and whether we need to incorporate solutions whenever we're talking about risks. And what also affects that is whether or not we think that the solutions are realistic to us, and also whether we agree with the solution. What also affects in that perception is, have you experienced something? If you've experienced a storm, you're more likely to perceive that as a risk than if you haven't experienced that storm. I imagine that Carl's, were they your grandparents, Carl, or not? They were your friends?
An aunt and uncle, yeah.
Aunt and uncle. They're probably going to be a little bit more inclined to view a storm coming differently than they did before they went through that experience. And then finally, do you trust the messenger? An example of this I like to use is that I have a friend that has family down in Florida, and last year when Hurricane Matthew came and they were in an evacuation zone, their response was, yeah, I don't trust the weather people. I don't trust the government telling me to do this. They have a very individualistic worldview, and so they're kind of, they're not trusting of everybody else in that regard. And so it took a phone call from my friend in New Jersey to call down to their family and their friends in Florida to say, you know what, I think you might want to take this seriously. And it was because their friends and their family and those people that they really deeply trust said, this is a thing and you need to pay attention to it. That's ultimately what triggered them to evacuate. And a few key takeaways that I just wanted to just reiterate. Again, more information alone does not change minds or behavior. And when you're talking about risk, it's important to include ways to take action, find solutions to manage that risk. It's important to speak to their personal values and their motivations and feelings, not yours. If you are terrified about something or you're really worried about something and they're not, invoking that fear or invoking those emotions may be something that's not helpful to them. And that also goes into avoiding fear and anxiety in these conversations unless you often talk about ways to take action. And one of the things that we like to talk about in my group of professionals is that when you're having a conversation, if you're going to use fear and anxiety as those motivators, make sure that it's only about a third of the fear and anxiety and 2/3 hope and solution, so that you're avoiding triggering and that landslide of emotion and people are saying, nope, I'm not worrying about this. I can't do anything anyway. The next thing I want to make a point is that you can't force people to change. And the more that you try, the more that they retreat in their beliefs. And a lot of the time I get people saying, why can't I just convince people of this information? Why can't I just convince people to understand the science? And my response to that is always, first I need you to remove the words convince and convert out of your vocabulary because they're not real things. If you ever have a spouse and you're trying to just get them to do something, notice that you can't just order them or you just can't convince them. My mom used to always tell me when I was a kid and wouldn't clean my room that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. That's kind of the same way here. You can, however, inspire them to want to change. And that's kind of how I view things, in that you want to inspire people and empower people to find things for themselves and use that to inspire how they want to change their behavior. And finally, people will be more likely to change their minds and behavior the more that they hear better answers from people that they trust, rather than necessarily having that conversation where you're just giving facts about a risk. Talk about how that risk is personal and how it affects something that they care about, and connect it to those things that they care about. And that way it makes that risk resonate more, and then connect it into ways that they can take action. Quick thing, just for a quick plug, NOAA's Office for Coastal Management has this great webinar on 7 best practices for risk communication. The next one is actually September 28th. You can learn more about it on Digital Coast. And also on the page with the Risk Communication Guidebook, there's several resources primarily for folks who are doing outreach regarding coastal hazards and coastal risks. And the first one is an example of a handout that incorporates risk communication best practices, where we talk about the risk and we talk also about primarily what can you do. What can you do in the short term and what can you do in the long term to manage flooding risks. And so this was a project that I worked on last year with Office for Coastal Management to see if we could find another way to communicate about flood risk. The second one that's on there is a PowerPoint template that we created to, if we were going to have a conversation or a public engagement meeting about flooding, how could we do it so that it incorporated more risk communication best practices? And so throughout this template, I don't know if I took out a bunch of the slides, but it's annotated throughout with a lot of comments through why you might want to phrase something differently, or what is a resource that you could use to develop graphics. What are ways that you can incorporate interactive and engagement activities in your presentation, and so that ultimately makes the presentation a little bit more effective and more and resonates better with folks. And finally, I just wanted to note that all of the work that I've done with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management has been done also in partnership with the Jacques Cousteau NEAR and the New Jersey Coastal Program, and I want to thank them very much for creating that opportunity. And so if you have any questions, obviously I'll be able to answer them at the end, but if you want to take down my email address, you can email me at any time, and that's my first name dot last name at rutgers.edu.
Thank you very much. That was great. I'll just ask before we pass it to Rachel, just for everybody to make sure that they mute their line. We picked up a little bit of static in parts of that, so if you're not talking, just to make sure you mute your telephone lines. So Rachel, you're up.
Okay, can you see my screen, Carl?
Not yet.
Not yet.
All right, I just got out. You should have your share.
Okay, share my screen. Got it.
Yep.
Okay, and here we go. Now can you see my screen?
It is loading.
There?
It's still trying.
Okay. Oh, I see why. I think I didn't. Now I think it's working.
There we go.
Okay, sorry.
Check.
I had stopped short one button too few to hit. Okay, hello everybody. It's great to be on the call with you today. I am going to talk about some of the social science research work that Nurture Nature Center has done that's going to take some of the great information we just got from Sarah and add a little fine point to it about how some of this decision making comes into play when people are trying to interpret that information. I always love hearing Sarah talk, and the first takeaway that giving more and more information is an inclination of many, especially professionals during a hazard, but but without making that information usable and actionable, it doesn't always help. And so our work has looked at actually the content of that information and what makes that information work more or less well. And I've titled this presentation off the name of one of our several research studies that was focused on coastal issues, because that's our audience today, and because it's a title that I think applies across the board. They had the facts, why didn't they act? And that's the question so many of us have, especially when looking at Sandy, which had an amazing forecast that said a pretty good representation of what was going to happen, and you still had some decision making that was not in everyone's safety. So I have the date wrong. It's not August 9th, but I keep falling behind on the date. So Nurture Nature Center, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is a nonprofit organization based in Easton, Pennsylvania. We've done a lot of work on flood education outreach and recently social science research about what motivates people to take action. And we serve as sort of a mediator between public audiences and the professionals and policymakers and scientists to try to make sure that the information flow back and forth between those two sectors is as efficient as it possibly can be. So we spend time with public audiences trying to figure out what they need and how they need it, and we share that back with the experts, and we spend a lot of time with the experts trying to figure out what information they believe the public really ought to have and know in order to make good decisions. And so we are kind of trying to be the link between those two bodies to improve flood response. We received our first social science research grant in 2012 as one of 4 funded by NOAA, and that looked at public response to riverine flood forecast products in Easton, Pennsylvania, and Lambertville, New Jersey, which I'll talk about. And again, in 2014, following up on the success of that and the interesting findings, NOAA Sea Grant and the New Jersey Sea Grant Consortium funded a project through their Coastal Storm Awareness Program for us to look at the populations affected by Superstorm Sandy. Our partners on all of these projects, we've worked very closely with Burl Mons of East Carolina University on all of the studies, and the others were other partners who came in to serve various functions along the way. The important partners, of course, are our National Weather Service partners. They've worked really closely with us in the weather forecast offices and in the river forecast office to help us understand the products that they're issuing to the public, and you'll see what we did with them together. And the fundamental issue that we're looking at here is that the Weather Service issues increasingly accurate and increasing amounts and quantity and variety of information that's timely and accurate to increasingly high levels all the time, and yet people are still not making good decisions. And one of our first partners and close friends is Gary Kowski. Many of you probably remember him as the meteorologist in charge of the Mount Holly forecast office that covered our region during Superstorm Sandy, and he has now retired, but was a big proponent for the role of social science and would say that over his career he watched technology and forecast capacity increase and watched public response not improve commensurately. And he was a big proponent that the Weather Service and everyone needed to start focusing on this angle of human and public response so that people can understand it and take the right action with the time they're given. And that's what we've been looking at. So the fundamental questions with our projects, and I'm going to lump them together and deal with them all as one because I think the takeaways work that way, are what tools, including Weather Service and others, are populations in Pennsylvania and New Jersey using to understand their riverine and coastal flood risk? So at this base level, what are the things people are using? Then secondarily, what improvements to these products make them easier to understand? And my favorite part, and more likely to motivate people to take protective actions. We learned from our early outreach initiatives that people did not always understand weather forecasts, and we knew that making them more easily understood was an important mission, but as Sarah pointed out, it's not just about understanding, it's about being motivated to then take action. So how do you do that through a forecast product? Specifically in the coastal region, one of the questions we were really looking at is emergency briefing packages, which are issued from the Weather Service to emergency managers and increasingly started coming out into the public sector through social media and other ways during Superstorm Sandy. And we saw that happening during Sandy and wanted to study in particular what role they could play in communicating risk and motivating residents to take action. Our methods for these projects have been focus groups, surveys, and interviews. We did 2 rounds with each community on the Riverine study. I mentioned those were Easton, PA, and Lambertville, New Jersey, highly flood-prone communities along the Delaware River that had found themselves underwater many times in the preceding years prior to the study. In New Jersey, we did Ocean and Monmouth County residents, emergency managers, and we did 4 focus groups there with people who had largely been affected by Superstorm Sandy. We also did some broadcast meteorology interviews on the side with that one. In both cases, we surveyed the residents as part of the focus group process and did iterative testing of the product. So we did 2 rounds of focus groups in each community, and I'll explain that. We had, in the focus groups, which were about 2 hours each, we would present a scenario, a weather scenario. There were about 15 people in the room on average, and they would talk with us for 2 hours and give us their feedback in an open conversation about the timing of the products, when they wanted to receive them, the graphic design and visual clarity, the ways the products motivated action, and how they shared information with others. These were, you see on the right-hand side, some of the samples of the kinds of products we showed. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. We used a scenario format as the basis of each of the focus groups because it helped to provide context to how people made decisions. And so over the course of the 2 hours, we would walk them through a 5 to 7 day scenario of approaching weather. In the case of the Riverine, we used a simulated East Coast hurricane, and the Weather Service mocked up some products based on the flood of record of 1955. So they went back and looked at the actual impacts and the actual weather patterns that happened and created a series of products like they would today if that event were happening again. Starting with a hurricane cone, starting with the hurricane, starting down around Florida and moving all the way up. And you can see the list of products that we shared with the public there, the hurricane cones, hydrographs, river flood outlooks, precipitation forecasts, flood watches, and ensemble forecasts that show uncertainty. On the coastal scenario, we were so close to Sandy, we just used Sandy and showed them the actual products that had been delivered during Sandy, trying to make them take a leap of imagination. So close to an actual tremendous event was too much. And so we showed them the actual products and said, this was issued at this time leading up to the storm. How did you react? Did you see it? If you didn't, how would you have? What kind of actions? What do you believe that this product is trying to tell you? We looked on the coastal side at the extratropical surge, surface prognosis maps in the lower right there showing high and low weather patterns, quantitative precipitation forecast, wind speed and direction, and on the far right, briefings, as I mentioned, were our key focus. So we spent a lot of hours in these focus groups with residents. We would do two focus groups in each community, gather the feedback, take their findings that we learned from them, and mock up the products and change them based on the user feedback that we had and based on our understanding of risk communication. And then we went back months later in each community and held the focus groups again with the exact same scenario and a new group of people. So they were getting the same storyline, but the products were presented differently. And we were able to learn a lot from that. Some of what we learned is a key message that local specificity is really critical for motivating action. People need to know that this event is salient for them in their community. Regional information did not work well. Naming names of towns worked very well. And I like to remember in the coastal community, there was a woman who said she didn't believe Superstorm Sandy was a risk to her until she happened to see the name of her small town on the Jersey Shore on national news. And they happened to mention the name of the town that she was in, and all of a sudden she realized, oh my goodness, this applies to me. So even though all the forecasts had previously shown her area until her community name was named, it hadn't really hit home. Similarly, detailed information that is specific to the person is really important. That includes river levels. For river residents, knowing exactly how high the river level is going to be at a point was critical information for them that they needed to know, and was one of the most motivational factors for people who were living in riverine communities. I consider these two quite closely linked. People need to develop saliency and understand that this risk is going to affect them. One of the huge takeaways, of course, is that visual design and language choice in the products create tremendous barriers and opportunities for people who are trying to understand these. I'll show a few examples of that. To reiterate what Sarah said, residents want to hear detailed action steps. They want people to tell them what to do. Very much. When it came to briefings, they said, it's great that you tell us everything that happened meteorologically, but that doesn't help me to know what I'm supposed to do about that. So put that all at the end and up front, tell me exactly what you want me to do. Coastal residents and emergency managers really love these briefings. I think that these are critical tools. I'll explain why. And we learned something about the timing that people want these things. They like to know 5 and 4 days in advance what's going on. Any further out than that, and it feels unreal. Any closer than that, and they're getting behind the game in terms of preparing. So here's an example of one of the mock-ups. We didn't radically transform the briefings, but we took some of those findings. The left is what they had issued on October 29th. On the right is an example of minor changes that nonetheless the residents told us would have made them to pay much more attention. The use of red, the use of bold, putting action information up front, keeping storm details in the back. One important issue is who distributes it. People trust the Weather Service as their source of information, but they need to make the local connection and said, have our emergency managers give us these packages. Then we know we have high quality information coming from a local source that thinks we need to know it. Connecting to the forecaster is one of the things that the emergency briefings did very well in these products. And those of you who were in Sandy may remember this personal plea that came out in the briefing from Gary Kowski. That was an unusually personal comment from an emergency official, from a weather official, saying, I am essentially begging you to please evacuate if you're in a dangerous area and worry about the rest later. And you can call me later and yell at me if I'm wrong. If this weather forecast is wrong and it's a bust, yell at me, I'll just be glad you're alive. It was highly motivational to people to make that connection between themselves and another person. It hit triggers for motivating action in a way that a weather graphic was not likely to do. And so although there are caveats about overdoing personal pleas, certainly, and thresholds for when to reach them, it's an important finding about how people make decisions in line with what Sarah was explaining. Here's just a few examples of some of the products. This is a river level hydrograph that's issued in riverine communities. This is one of the ones that we shared when it was starting to show that the river was going to climb. People love this. This was their Bible. They thought it was visually clear, very specific. It was a really serious go-to product for them, which is important to understand. We made some changes to it, but that was one of the winning ones. Critically, the use of color was a tremendous factor in how people understood and interpreted information. So the use of color could be very positive, as in the case of this product, which clearly delineated precipitation areas by color on this map. So people responded positively to this because they understood that red was the area with the highest level of rain. They could identify were they in it and how much rain they were going to get. In other cases, confusing use of color or conflicting use of color or a lack of color or a lack of visual font variation was very confusing. As in the case of this product, the Significant River Flood Outlook, this product gives people a 5-day heads up that they are going to have a possible flood event. And that's what everyone in those communities said that they wanted, but when we showed it to them, they did not like it. The reasons for that is that this map gave very poor geographic detail. The patterning was very difficult to distinguish. At the bottom, it says, with one pattern, it says that flooding is possible. Another says it's likely. But they couldn't distinguish which one was where in their area. They didn't know what the word significant really meant. It didn't really tell them too much. And so this is one that we had to significantly revamp. In the coastal community, this is the extratropical surge graphic that shows where the water levels are anticipated to get. People did not well receive this one nor understand it. So it needed a lot more explanation in terms of identifying information in a legend. And these details cannot be overlooked, that terms must be explained, legends must be clear, must easily distinguish between various components. And we changed the title of products when they didn't tell anyone anything. No one knew what extratropical surge meant, but observed and forecast water levels they could understand. At the top, we put important notes in red from the forecasters to allow them to call out the important information that's being shown in the graphic, because people frequently said, can you say that in a sentence? I don't understand. And if they don't understand what the product is telling them, they either take no action, or in some cases worried that they would take the wrong action because they misunderstood the content. In the interest of time, I'm just going to go quickly through these so you can see the small product on the left is as it was shown in the round 1. In round 2 is as it was mocked up. And you can see significant additions in use of color to portray information distinguishing between observed and forecast, higher explanations in the legends, clearer titling. We made products linked to active warnings that might be in effect. The 5-day river flood outlook was retitled, had different patterning, added geographic specificity, and started calling the flooding damaging rather than significant, as people told us that that was not a helpful term. We looked at some uncertainty products that show a range of outcomes, and those were deeply disturbing to people because they could not understand those products at the bottom of the slide there. They had no idea what they were trying to say, but the information about the range of possibility was interesting to them, so these needed to be significantly overhauled. And you can see an example of one on the right that we revamped to explain uncertainty and forecast substantially, with increased legends, use of color to demonstrate the level of confidence in the forecast, and many other changes that were done in this one. This has been transitioned into operations by the Middle Atlantic River Forecast Center. They have revised their products, and actually it looks much more like our recommendations now and is being much better received and more widely used, and it's become a more helpful tool for them. We're in the process of doing a third study on the HEFS, which is the Hydrologic Ensemble Forecast System for nationwide, that shows that same sort of uncertainty. And we have finished all of the data collection for that project and are now assembling our findings and our revised study there. All of that information and the information I just showed you is at socialscience.focusonfloods.org. We have a page, coastal.focusonfloods.org, that delves a little bit more into some of the coastal studies themselves. But there you'll find project information, you'll find our reports, you'll find videos, resources, and a research bibliography on some of the social science related to flooding for those who might be interested there. And this is my contact information.
All right, thank you for that, Rachel.
Thank you.
And now we will turn it over to Mike. Are you ready? Rachel, I think you just have to exit out of that so that he can queue up his slides.
How do I stop sharing?
There you go.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Okay, all set. Okay.
Can everyone see the screen?
You can see it? Yep.
Okay, very good. Okay, so thanks again, Carl, for organizing this, and you know, it's quite interesting as you hear the presentations and such, and you know, we've worked closely with Rachel on a few programs that she did here, and you know, the things that I'm going to talk about, you know, she actually helped us along the way. She may not know it, you know, as she's doing her presentations, but, you know, we in the emergency management community now are kind of charged with, you know, implementing, you know, all that risk communication and how that's done. And and how effectively we manage that and get that out to our constituents is always quite challenging. And some of the things that came out of some of the studies were, well, we really don't hear anything about emergency management and all this stuff unless something bad's happening. So, we wanted to go back and say, all right, so how do we implement some programs that we can say that we're out in the face of the public on a more consistent basis throughout the year. And so one of the things that we did immediately after Sandy was to take a look at how things were happening in the county and why towns weren't taking advantage of some of the programs and initiatives that were out there. And one of the big things that came up was the community rating system. We formulated a users group after taking a look at the number of towns that should be participating in this system and the towns that weren't. And basically it all boiled down to, at the end of the day, like Rachel and Sarah both said, hey, how does this impact me? It doesn't impact me. It doesn't affect me on a daily basis. So they weren't really taking the initiative to do that. And plus all of the workload that was each community needed to do to implement this process. So we formulated this working group or users group in 2013 in an effort to kind of standardize some of the programs or portions of CRS that we could all share, like each town could share. So everybody didn't have to do all of the same work. Some of it was inherent across the borders and things, so we wanted to try to standardize that and make some uniform assistance to the towns. And we wanted to increase participation, right, because, we didn't have a lot of participation in there, and people weren't seeing the benefits of what the CRS system, does, the community rating system. And I'm sure most of all of you know that, your participation in that system, in that program sponsored through the federal government, FEMA, and so forth, that you reduce your flood insurance premiums for, each of the tiers that you enter into the system. And every time you go down a tier or, improve your rating, you save some additional monies on your insurance premiums. So when we started out with 8 towns. Since we started, we've added 4 additional towns to the process. We have 2 that are currently in the process of going through the implementation, and 2 that have improved their classification, and 3 that are actively pursuing it. And currently, we are saving the residents in those towns $1.4 million in premiums, which is a $333,000 increase since we started the program. So where does all this come into play with risk communication? So our thought when we started this was simply trying to save people money and help the towns get involved in the program. And as we started to look, a lot of the points and systems in CRS are geared around public outreach and education, and that we started to see that this was a way that we could start to sell our products, that risk communication, out to the residents, not only residents, but the government, the governing bodies of these towns, because they had true benefit to each of them in the way of saving money on their insurance premiums. Now, we're not talking millions of dollars in each community or millions of dollars to each individual homeowner, but a slight 5% increase on a $2,000 policy, $100, where are they spending that money? They're spending that money back in the communities in which they live. There's not enough money to take the family on an extravagant vacation or anything, so we're putting money back in their pockets that come into their communities. So we use that as a springboard for developing our first real big push for public outreach. And this was the Highwater initiative. This program is a FEMA program which we partnered up with FEMA Region 2 and headquarters to launch here in Monmouth County. And what we did is we took a look at those towns that were participating in CRS, focused on them first, and then added some other towns that were either in the process thereof going into the CRS program or just had an inherent risk of flooding. And what this campaign was designed to do was to put these signs out in the communities to alert the residents and visitors and businesses as to what the risk could be. So these signs were all put out at where the high water mark, the historical high water mark was in Sandy. We put, let me get to, oh, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. So we put a bunch of these signs out, about 100 of these signs out in various communities within the county. We had a big launch event, which I have a slide that will show down the road here with FEMA Region 2. We looked at putting these in areas where people would see them. We didn't put them in the middle of the communities. We put them out in public areas, parks, waterfront locations, and things like that, so that we weren't impacting any of the real estate market in the area. That was a big concern with, keeping people in the minds that when, this sign is at 7 feet above ground, we didn't want to scare people away, and that was a lot of the concerns of the governing body officials. So what we did is we actually partnered with a wide variety of people as we look to implement this program. Obviously, as I mentioned, FEMA Region 2 and headquarters was a big supporter of the program. We had 14 towns that participated, all voluntarily. We asked each of these towns, their governing bodies, to pass resolutions or an ordinance that they would be willing participants in this, because we didn't want a floodplain manager or an emergency manager agreeing to participate without their governing body support, and putting these signs up in the town, and then there being issues behind the scenes with political undertones and all the other real estate sales and stuff. So as we looked at our communities that were involved in this, we reached out to a couple of our federal partners here. We have a naval weapons station here in Monmouth County that has some waterfront footage over there, acreage over there for their filling of their ships and things, and the National Park Service out on Sandy Hook, which was highly impacted by Superstorm Sandy. So we engaged their participation because we wanted to make sure that the park system, with all the visitors out there, saw what was happening here, and what those folks that are stationed out on Earl, that we wanted to make sure that they were aware of the risks as well. And, we couldn't have done this without those folks over at Monmouth University's Urban Coast Institute. They actually provided all the surveying for us of where all the signs were going, and the height above ground where they needed to go, with Jim Nichols and Tony McDonald over there. You saw and heard about Lisa Aramuller and the Jacques Cousteau near. They were an extreme partner in this as well. And one of the interesting things that have come out of this now is we've partnered with the New Jersey Sea Grant Consortium, who have developed an educational component of this high watermark initiative for schools, grade school, elementary school, from 2nd grade through 8th grade. And we've put the curriculum out in the hands of the schools, and they are now incorporating this educational component about surge and this high watermark, and what this means to each of the students in their home communities in a curriculum form. And this is being done either in science or math or social studies, however they see fit. They have some different avenues in which they can implement this, but they're really it's really kind of an innovative type of way to start to educate our kids and get them on board with this. And we had New Jersey DEP that participated in this, and they allowed us to install we made some smaller metal tags that we put out, about 200 of them out in various communities on their utility poles. They're just little metal tags, almost like the signs that they use to identify the poles, and we were able to put them out in the communities as well. This is a picture of Mike Moriarty at our High Watermark Initiative launch back in 2016. We did this at the Belford Marina over in Middletown, and we had some signs installed on that building that was damaged, and we had some community partners there, and we spoke about how this is being implemented across the county. So since our launch date in June 27th of 2017, which towns had the ability to choose whether they wanted Irene or Sandy or both, we've put out 100 signs. We put 150 tags out. The communities have been receiving community rating system outreach points as part of that, and I mentioned the New Jersey Sea Grant school curriculum already. And one of the interesting things that we've done is that, you know, we kind of said that we have to take an approach from the county as we look at all hazards. We look at all avenues to make reference to the risk that we have here in the county. And we just completed a countywide master plan update, which was the first one in about 30 years. And we've actually made reference in various sections of this plan on the hazard mitigation plan of the county by reference. We've built into this master plan a resiliency section, which talks about, you know, how to be more resilient in the communities for ordinances, floodplain management, and all that other stuff. And the thing with this is that we were able to reach a new diverse audience, which we never have before. So these actions and these thoughts are being brought into the overall planning process. In addition to the high watermark signs out there, we have now created an infographic which we put out at all of our public events, and it kind of walks through the high watermark initiative, talks about the surge risks and so forth. And the most recent development or addition to this is that we've actually created a story map. That's the web link is here to that. It's under our planning division, our community rating system portal there. And what this does now is everywhere there's a sign in the county, we've mapped the story to that back to the local residents. The sign, picture of the sign is there. And then we have some picture of some damage that showing here that occurred in those communities during Sandy to kind of bring that back home to them to say, yeah, this is why that sign is there. This is what the results of that storm were. And this is why it's important to pay attention to that risk communication that is coming out from the public officials here. And just to tout a little bit about this, the both programs, the High Watermark Initiative and the CRS, have been very successful in receiving some awards across the country. The Sustainable Raritan River gave us an Innovation Award on the High Watermark Initiative. The National Association of Counties presented us with a Resiliency and Infrastructure Achievement Award for the CRS program, and NOAA on our Excellence in Government for the CRS program. So it's nice to be recognized outside of the communities here for the work that's being taken here. And this is a cooperative effort on all those between the Office of Emergency Management and our Planning Division. So as we went forward, looking at some other avenues here, speaking to the what Rachel had and Sarah had mentioned is directly talking to those that are most at risk. If you recall, during Sandy and Irene, the evacuation orders that came out were using messages like, quote unquote, get the hell off the beach. If you've lived in if you live in a flood zone, if you've flooded in the past, if you live near a body of water, you need to evacuate. And you know, why they worked to the best that they could have, you know, with those messages, we said, hey, from Monmouth County standpoint, we need to take a better look, and we need to be starting to communicate with those that are most at risk, and we need to be as to the point and direct with them as we possibly can. So we went back and we started to develop a coastal evacuation plan. And we certainly stole the Know Your Zone from New York City, Florida, and the Carolinas, but we created evacuation zones in the county, A, B, C, and D, and obviously A being our closest to the coast and those most at risk. And our intent is that over the next 3 to 5 years, as we pound this communication out to our residents, that eventually we'll be able to talk to those folks. If you live in Zone A, you're under some type of evacuation order, or if you're in Zone B. And we're talking only to those folks that are based on forecast that are at the greatest risk. And we're not asking, as we did in Sandy, close to 200,000 people to move when we really only need to talk to maybe 20 or 30,000 folks. And this helps us with, obviously, planning for shelters and the other things with there. So this program started, and we initiated this and launched it last September, and we've been very good. We have a website. Folks go right in, put their information in there, and it directs them to what zone they're in. The next feature of this is that we are working with one of our coastal towns to implement this into their seasonal rental certificates of occupancy, where the proper zone pamphlet, we have zone pamphlets that go with each one of these, will have to be posted in those rental properties in order for them to get their CO, much like their fire extinguisher certifications and occupancy levels and things like that. As I said, it's a tiered system. The communication is set for targeted outreach to those that are at greatest risk. We have some great population demographics behind each zone now, so we know what those people and what the makeup is of those communities in each of those zones. Special needs, number of properties, number of pets, and all those types of things. And basically, we started. We have a full county plan for that, which has trigger points and those types of information behind it. And inherently, we find out that there are community rating system activity 610, which is the one of the components of that with a municipal appendice to this plan, the towns are ready for, are eligible for an additional 395 points on the community rating system, which in many cases will take towns into a lower tier, then saving them some additional monies on their insurance premiums. So we kind of took a look at, the communication outreach and said, how do we make it enticing for the residents and the communities to do. The pocketbook always seems to be a good way to do that. And with the ability to tie all of these risk communications initiatives back to a program with the community rating system where people are putting money in their pockets, it's been very successful for us in communicating that risk out to them, and it's been well received out in the community. And we really just use the CRS savings every time we talk about any of these new initiatives or the risks that were out there and how it ties back to the dollars and cents in their pocket. So just kind of our way of implementing, the risk communications and putting it out on the street in an application type manner, and how it's worked for us. So I thank you all for the opportunity to talk, and hopefully we'll turn it over to Carl for final comments and questions and whatever.
Yes, so I did build in about 10 extra minutes of time in case things ran over. So now I'd just like to open it up to the audience for any questions that they might have from the speakers. And if you're on the phone line, you can chime in that way, or you can just type into the chat room. I see one coming in. Just one moment. I see a couple of people are typing. Okay, this first one is from Sarah Spiegler. Thanks for a great presentation. Will you be able to share the slides to our speakers? Would that be possible? I can post them online.
That'd be great by me. This is Rachel.
Great.
This is Sarah. Yeah, that's fine.
Mike, I'm fine with that as well.
Okay, and what I'll do is I'll send an email to everybody who registered when the recording and the slides are posted, and I'll also, if you follow the UCI's Twitter, Facebook, etc., you can check, keep an eye on them for links or on our homepage, which is monmouth.edu/UCI. Any others out there? Here's just one from me. A year before Sandy, Irene was hyped as a huge storm, and it did a lot of damage inland, but not that much to the shore area. And I wonder, and it kind of felt to me like that gave people a false sense of security. Like we saw the worst storm, we got hit by a hurricane, and it was no big deal. Although it's been quiet since Sandy, it seems like people have taken the storm warnings that we have seen since then a lot more seriously, even snowstorms. I wonder if you have any thoughts on how we get people to keep their guard up, even after possibly some of the false alarms that we'll see.
This is Rachel. So Nurture Nature Center was formed in 2000.
Your conference call will end in 10 minutes.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem. It's a good heads up. Nurture Nature Center was formed in 2007 after repetitive flooding on the Delaware, where we're located, in 2004, 5, and 6. So it had been 50 years before when we hadn't had a major flood. We had 3 major floods in 22 months. And at the time, everybody was really attentive to flooding issues and thought that it was really important. And Nurture Nature Center was formed, and one of the first things that we talked about was the social science theory of the window of opportunity after a major disaster, where people are receptive to information, and it's about a 2-year window, and then the window closes. This is kind of a social science trope about that. And it's been interesting to watch that develop here in this community and in others. I think the answer to that, in my opinion, is to create a community, embed a sense of risk in the community's narrative about who and what it is. And I think Monmouth is showing us exactly examples of how to do that, so that the story of who Monmouth is or the story of who Easton is incorporates resilience to inevitable flooding and not diverting to the fact of saying, well, that was a really big freak event. Luckily, that won't happen again. But building the actual risk into the story of who we are and the pride that we're ready to be responsive to it and ready to take care of one another when it happens.
As a follow-up to that, do you have a feeling that people feel they are better prepared for the quote-unquote next Sandy with all of that?
I would let maybe Mike and Sarah answer that down in the coast. I'm not there. I could tell you about Easton, but I'd like to hear the coastal perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So what was the question again? I apologize.
Just what is your sense as to whether people feel they're better prepared for the next big storm? And if they are, to what extent do you think that is due to their awareness of, risk and vulnerability?
Yeah, I think we're making progress in getting people prepared, and certainly, the topic is always out there with them as best as we can to put it out there for them all. But there's always a slight portion that aren't really aren't really doing it, but they just need to pay attention to the message that's out there.
I think that, this is Sarah, I think there are people that are definitely more prepared, but then we also have people who are falling into that single action bias where perhaps they've elevated their house, and so they may or may not be more likely to leave when a storm is imminent because they think that their house is fine, but they forget that the road to them might be cut off, or their car might get flooded, or they may not, if they get in trouble, emergency services can't reach them. So that's one thing I do see more and more, and I am getting concerned about it, but I think it also, I echo very deeply what Rachel said about making resilience and risk part of the community fabric and part of the community culture, that the more we talk about it, the more that becomes part of reality.
All right. From the audience, any last questions here before we cut it off? Very well. Then thanks again to our presenters and to all of you for coming. As I said a little earlier, the recording will be posted on monmouth.edu/UCI, possibly by the end of the day, but certainly within a day or two. And I'll email a link around to everyone who registered and share it on social media, etc. And have a great day, and thanks again for coming.